This isn't a story I read somewhere. This is my life, what really happened to me just a few years ago. It's taught me that the most dangerous venom often comes from the people who are supposed to be your family. The air in Arthur Hemmings's law office on Broad Street in Charleston was thick with the scent of old leather, lemon polish, and the damp chill of a coming coastal storm. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Vance, slid a single, freshly printed document across the vast mahogany desk, its surface gleaming like dark water. It was an addendum to the family will, and as it came to a stop before me, the first thing I saw was my own name, Clara Vance, neatly underlined in red ink and marked for total, unequivocal exclusion from the Vance family estate. She watched me, a tight, triumphant smile twisting her perfectly painted lips, absolutely certain that after 3 years of trying, she had finally, irrevocably won. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The first time I met Eleanor Vance, she looked straight through me. Not at me, but through me, as if I were a particularly uninteresting pane of glass. It was at a garden party at her sprawling historic home, one of those magnificent South of Broad mansions with double-tiered piazzas and a garden overflowing with azaleas and ancient moss-draped oaks. I had met her son Thomas 6 months prior in a far less glamorous setting, the archives of the Charleston Library Society. I was a research fellow, helping to restore a collection of 18th-century mercantile ledgers. He was a corporate lawyer researching a pro bono case involving historic property lines. He'd spilled an entire cup of coffee near a priceless document, and I'd practically tackled him to save it. We had dinner that night at FIG, and that was it. I was completely, hopelessly in love with him. Thomas was nothing like the world he came from. He was kind, self-deprecating, and saw the Vances' immense wealth not as a birthright, but as a heavy, sometimes burdensome, responsibility. His father, Richard Vance, had been the same. Richard was the heart of the family, a man with a booming laugh and a genuine passion for history, the very thing that connected us. When Thomas brought me home to meet his parents, Richard had embraced me instantly. He'd spent 3 hours showing me his private collection of colonial maps, his eyes sparkling with a joy Eleanor's never seemed to possess. Eleanor's eyes were different. They were calculators. When she looked at me, I could feel her assessing my dress, which was from a modest boutique, not King Street. I could feel her clocking my sensible shoes, my lack of heirloom jewelry, my quiet middle-class origins. I was the daughter of a high school history teacher and a nurse from Columbia. In Eleanor's world, I was an invasive species, a weed in her perfectly manicured garden. She made her disapproval clear in 1,000 tiny ways, each one a perfectly sharpened dart. At a dinner party, she'd ask me to tell the table about my work, and when I'd start to speak passionately about archival preservation, she'd interrupt with a sigh. "Oh, it's all so very dusty, isn't it?" When Thomas announced our engagement at the Carolina Yacht Club, she'd smiled for the pictures, but later I overheard her telling one of her friends, a woman draped in diamonds, "She's quite plain, but I suppose she's clever." Thomas always did have a soft spot for strays. Her cruelty was an art form. It was never a direct blow, always a glancing one, designed to leave a deep bruise no one else could see. Richard saw it, though. He was my defender. He'd cut his wife off with a sharp, "Eleanor, that's enough." He'd pull me aside and squeeze my hand, his warmth a stark contrast to her icy composure. "Don't you mind her, Clara," he'd whisper. "She's just afraid of anyone whose worth can't be measured in dollars." He was the reason I stayed. He made me feel like I belonged in the Vance family, even when its matriarch tried her best to excise me. Then, 2 years before that day in the lawyer's office, Richard died. A sudden, massive heart attack on the golf course. The light and warmth of the family went out with him. His will was, we thought, his final act of protection. He left the entire Vance estate, a portfolio of stocks, properties, and trusts worth a staggering amount, in a carefully structured testamentary trust. Eleanor was the primary trustee and beneficiary, entitled to live in the manner to which she was accustomed. But the principal was untouchable. Upon her death, It was to pass in its entirety to Thomas, his only child. The will also included a specific, beautiful clause Richard had written himself, stating that his son's wife, whomever she may be, but whom I hope with all my heart is Clara, was to be considered a direct heir alongside his son, ensuring her financial security for life. It was his final gift to me, a shield against his wife's malice. Or so I thought. Eleanor, it turned out, saw the will not as her husband's final wishes, but as his final mistake. One she was determined to correct. Which brought us here to this polished mahogany desk. Mr. Hemmings, the family lawyer for over 40 years, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary lines, cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable, his gaze shifting between me and the damning document. "Eleanor, are you certain about this?" he asked, his voice thin. "Perfectly," she said, not looking at him, but at me. Her eyes were gleaming. Richard was a sentimental man. He was unwell in his final months, not thinking clearly. This oversight is simply a matter of housekeeping. The trust documents contain a clause allowing for administrative adjustments by the primary trustee to protect the estate's long-term viability. I am protecting it from a clear and present liability. A liability. That was me. 3 years of marriage, of loving her son, of trying to build a bridge to her frozen heart. And I was a line-item risk to be mitigated. Thomas, sitting beside me, was pale. He loved his mother, but he was in shock. "Mother, what is this? We talked about this. You can't just write my wife out of Dad's will." "I can and I am," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "This family's legacy was built over 2 centuries. It will not be diluted or squandered by a temporary guest. The addendum is prepared. All it requires is a final signature." She pushed the document closer to the lawyer. I felt the blood drain from my face. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, searing wave that threatened to choke me. She was doing this in front of me, in front of the man who had known this family for decades, turning my marriage into a business transaction she was now voiding. I looked at the page. My name, Clara Annabelle Vance. And below it, a line of cold legal jargon that amounted to a single brutal word: nothing. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, my chair scraping softly on the Persian rug. Thomas stood with me, grabbing my hand. His was trembling. "We're leaving," he said, his voice tight with a rage I'd rarely seen. "This is insane." Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply leaned back in her chair, a picture of regal satisfaction. "Run along, children," she purred. "But this document stays here. It will be executed by the end of the month. The family is for Vances, Clara. You'd do well to remember that." As we walked out, the last thing I saw was her triumphant smile, reflected in the polished surface of the desk where my future had just been erased. She thought she had checked every box, sealed every exit. But she had made one critical, fatal error. She had underestimated the quiet, dusty work of a trained archivist. And she had no idea that her late husband, my beloved father-in-law, had left behind more than just a will. He'd left behind the ammunition. And I was about to go to war. The drive back to our carriage house on Trad Street was silent and suffocating. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. The city's charm, the pastel-colored houses, the gas lamps flickering to life in the dusk, felt like a mockery. This beautiful, historic place was Eleanor's kingdom, and she had just declared me an exile. When we got inside, Thomas finally erupted. He paced the length of our living room, a torrent of anger and disbelief pouring out of him. He was a good man, a loving husband, but he had always possessed a blind spot when it came to his mother. He saw her as difficult, snobbish, and controlling, but he never believed her capable of this level of calculated cruelty. The veil had been torn away, and he was seeing the monster in its purest form. "I'll call Hemmings. I'll fight her. She can't do this," he vowed, running his hands through his hair. "Thomas, she just did," I said, my voice eerily calm. The initial shock was hardening into something else, something cold and sharp. "She told us exactly how she's doing it. A clause allowing for administrative adjustments by the primary trustee. That's the weapon. But that's for stock transfers, for property management. Not for disinheriting my wife. Your father's will was specific, I countered, the archivist in me taking over, my mind starting to catalog facts and search for patterns. It named me. To undo something that specific requires a powerful legal tool. She must have found one. For the next few days, Thomas was on the phone constantly with lawyers, with his mother, who refused his calls, and with a bewildered Arthur Hemmings, who kept repeating that his hands were tied. That Eleanor was the trustee and her interpretation of the clause was, while aggressive, not explicitly illegal. The system was on her side. The old Charleston money network closed ranks around its queen. It felt hopeless. I saw the weight of it crushing Thomas, forcing him to choose between his mother and his wife, a choice no child should have to make. That's when I stopped thinking like a wife and started thinking like a researcher. My grief for Richard, which had been a soft, aching sadness, sharpened into a new kind of focus. I remembered all those hours I'd spent with him in his study, a room Eleanor rarely entered, calling it his cluttered den of mold. It was a beautiful room, paneled in dark cypress and filled with books, maps, and boxes of family papers dating back to the 1700s. Richard had been the family historian, its unofficial archivist. He'd shown me letters, journals, property deeds. He'd often complained, with a sad shake of his head, about Eleanor's disinterest in their own history. She only cares about the name, Clara, he'd once told me, not the story behind it. He'd also complained about her spending. Eleanor believes the Vance fortune is a magic pudding, he'd said. A thing that can be endlessly consumed without ever shrinking. He was meticulous with his finances, a stark contrast to her casual extravagance. He kept detailed records of everything, and I knew exactly where he kept them. That weekend, I told Thomas the first needed to visit the main house to retrieve a few personal items I'd left there. It was a flimsy excuse, but he was too distracted to question it. He was meeting with yet another lawyer, trying to find a strategy. I let myself into the grand, silent house. The air was still and cool, smelling faintly of potpourri and furniture polish. It felt like a museum, a place where life was observed but not lived. I went straight to Richard's study. Eleanor had kept it exactly as he'd left it, not out of respect, but because she couldn't be bothered to deal with it. I closed the heavy doors behind me and went to his desk. Behind a row of leather-bound histories of the Carolinas was a small, almost invisible button. Richard had shown it to me once, a secret he shared only with me. I pressed it, and a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a small walk-in vault. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Inside were not jewels or gold, but rows upon rows of gray archival boxes, each one neatly labeled in Richard's elegant script. I started with the most recent financial statements for the estate trust. It took me hours sitting on the floor of that dusty, hidden room to piece it together. What I found made my blood run cold. Richard had been right to worry. Since his death, Eleanor had been systematically draining the estate. There were massive transfers to a consulting firm that, after a quick search on my phone, turned out to be a shell corporation for her friend's failing interior design business. There were charitable donations to organizations that had then paid her exorbitant speaking fees. She had leveraged a portfolio of stable, income-generating stocks to fund a series of highly speculative, high-risk investments in a friend's boutique hotel venture in Savannah, a project that was hemorrhaging money. She wasn't just living lavishly. She was setting the family legacy on fire to keep herself warm. She was destroying the very thing she claimed to be protecting from me. The clause she was using to disinherit me, the one about protecting the estate's long-term viability, was a smokescreen. She needed to cut me out because if I ever had a say in the finances, I would discover her fraud. My potential inheritance wasn't the target. It was collateral damage in the cover-up of her own incompetence and greed. But the real discovery, the one that changed everything, wasn't in the financial binders. It was in a simple manila folder labeled Correspondence with A. Hemmings. Inside were copies of letters between Richard and his lawyer going back years. And near the bottom, I found a memo Richard had sent to Hemmings just 6 months before he died. He was worried about Eleanor's spending habits and her growing resentment toward me. In the memo, he outlined his desire to add a specific codicil to the trust agreement. He called it the fiduciary guardian clause. It was a nuclear option, a contingency he hoped would never be needed. The clause stated that if the primary trustee, Eleanor, were ever found to be engaging in gross financial mismanagement or actions that deliberately undermined the stated intent of the will, such as attempting to disenfranchise a named heir without just cause, a third-party audit could be triggered. If that audit confirmed the mismanagement, the trustee's authority would be immediately and irrevocably revoked, and control of the entire estate would pass to a designated successor. My hands were shaking as I read the last line of the memo. He had written in his own hand, next to the line for the designated successor, Thomas Richard Vance and his spouse, Clara Annabelle Vance, as joint executors. There was a reply from Hemmings stapled to it, acknowledging the request and confirming the clause had been legally drafted and included in the final, signed version of the trust documents held in his office. Eleanor had no idea it existed. In her arrogance, she had only read the parts of the will that pertained to her power, not the parts that pertained to her limitations. She had handed me the gun, the bullets, and a map to her own execution. I carefully took pictures of every single document with my phone, the financial records, the Shell Corporation details, and most importantly, the memo about the fiduciary guardian clause. As I slipped out of the house, the afternoon sun felt different, warmer. The game had changed. I wasn't an exile anymore. I was a hunter. Eleanor Vance's power was woven into the very fabric of Charleston. It wasn't just in her bank account. It was in the deferential nod from the maitre d' at the Peninsula Grill, the way conversations paused when she entered a room at the Spoleto Festival USA Gala, the effortless way she could secure a last-minute, sold-out table at Husk by making a single phone call. Her influence was a currency more valuable than money in a city built on connections and lineage. She sat on the board of the Historic Foundation, the city's most prestigious museum, and the hospital. To cross her was to become a social pariah. She could have you blacklisted from every important invitation list in the city with a few whispered words over lunch at the High Cotton. She wielded this power against me with surgical precision. After the incident at the lawyer's office, the snubs escalated. An invitation to a fundraising dinner we'd always attended was lost in the mail. A friend of hers, a woman I'd always been cordial with, suddenly couldn't meet my eye at the Harris Teeter on East Bay Street. Eleanor was methodically and efficiently erasing me from the social landscape of the city we lived in, painting me as a greedy interloper who had tried to steal from her poor, grieving widow. The narrative was simple, effective, and utterly false. The apex of her campaign against me came during the annual Gibby's Museum of Art fundraiser, the crown jewel of the Charleston social calendar. Thomas and I decided to go, a unified front. We would not be cowed. I chose my dress with care, a simple but elegant navy blue gown. And I wore the one piece of significant jewelry I owned, a stunning sapphire and diamond brooch, shaped like a star magnolia. Richard had given it to me on our first wedding anniversary. He'd told me it belonged to his grandmother and that he wanted me to have it, as I was the true heir to her grace and spirit. It was my most treasured possession. We walked into the museum's soaring rotunda, and an immediate chill fell over the conversations around us. Eleanor was holding court near the grand staircase, a vision in emerald silk, a glass of champagne in her hand. She spotted us, and a slow, cruel smile spread across her face. She didn't approach us. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she let us drift, isolated, in the sea of tuxedos and gowns. People would offer tight, polite smiles, and then find a reason to move away. We were radioactive. Later in the evening, Eleanor made her move. She glided over to the museum director, a man whose salary was largely funded by her annual donations. She whispered something in his ear, her eyes flicking towards me. A few minutes later, the director approached us, his face a mask of professional regret. He was with the head of security. "Mrs. Vance," the director began, his voice low. "I am so sorry, but there seems to be a slight issue. Eleanor, your mother-in-law, has reported a piece of jewelry missing. A family heirloom." A sapphire brooch. My blood turned to ice. I instinctively touched the brooch pinned to my dress. All eyes in our vicinity were now on us. The whispers started, rippling through the crowd. She says it was taken from her jewelry box this past week, the director continued, his eyes not quite meeting mine. And she seems to believe you might have, mistakenly picked it up. It was a masterstroke of humiliation. She wasn't accusing me of theft directly. She was framing it as a dotty mistake, painting me as both a thief and a pathetic, confused child. She was using my most precious gift from her husband as the weapon to destroy my reputation. The security guard looked at the brooch, then at me. Thomas stepped in front of me, his face thunderous. This is outrageous. My father gave my wife that brooch. We are leaving. He took my arm and steered me through the crowd, which parted as if we were lepers. I could feel hundreds of eyes on my back. I could hear the triumphant, delicate laugh of my mother-in-law echoing behind us. As we stepped out into the humid night air, I felt a tear of pure rage slide down my cheek. Thomas was shaking. I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry. I never knew she could be like this. That night, everything changed. We went home and I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I calmly opened my laptop, pulled up the photos I had taken in the secret vault, and I showed him everything. The fraudulent invoices. The Shell Corporation. The doomed hotel investment. And finally, the memo about the fiduciary guardian clause. I laid out the full scope of his mother's deception, not just against me, but against his father's memory and the entire family legacy. He sat there for a full hour, in stunned silence, scrolling through the evidence. The son's denial crumbled, replaced by the cold, hard fury of a betrayed man. He finally looked up at me, his eyes clear and hard for the first time in weeks. The blind spot was gone. She's not just destroying you, he said, his voice raw. She's destroying everything my father built. Everything he believed in. Yes, I said softly. He reached across the table and took my hands. So what do we do? I looked at him, my resolve forged in the fire of that public humiliation. I was no longer just defending my marriage or my inheritance. I was avenging Richard. I was fighting for my dignity. I was done being the victim. We don't get angry, I said, my voice low and steady. We get smarter. We use her own arrogance against her. We're going to let her think she's won. And while she's celebrating, we are going to help her lawyer rewrite her will, right under her nose. And by the time she realizes what's happened, she will have already handed us the pen. The first step was the most dangerous. I had to approach Arthur Hemmings. I couldn't do it by phone or email. Those could be intercepted. I needed to see him in person, alone. Thomas made a loud, angry call to Hemmings's office, a piece of theater for anyone who might be listening, demanding another meeting to contest the addendum. As expected, Hemmings refused, stating his duty was to his client, the trustee Eleanor. But Thomas's call served its purpose. It solidified the narrative that we were flailing, fighting a losing battle. The next day, I went to the Charleston County Courthouse, a place I knew well from my archival work. I spent the morning in the deed records office, then accidentally ran into Mr. Hemmings in the hallway as he was leaving a filing. He looked tired, older than his years, and he flinched slightly when he saw me. Mrs. Vance, he said stiffly, clutching his briefcase. I've already told your husband. I'm not here to argue with you, Arthur, I said, using his first name, a subtle shift in our dynamic. I'm here to talk to you about your first client. Richard. His eyes flickered. I had his attention. Can we speak somewhere private? 5 minutes. For his sake. He hesitated, his gaze darting around the marble hall. Finally, he gave a curt nod. We walked in silence to a small, empty alcove overlooking a courtyard. I didn't waste any time. I took out my phone and showed him the picture of the memo, Richard's memo, about the fiduciary guardian clause. He stared at the screen, and I saw the color drain from his face. He remembered. Of course he remembered. Richard was worried, I said softly, but with a steel edge to my voice. He was worried this exact thing would happen. He worried that Eleanor's spending and her feelings would endanger the estate. He put that clause in place to protect his legacy, to protect his son, and to protect me. Hemmings looked away, out at the courtyard. Eleanor is the trustee. My duty is to her. Is it? I pressed. Or is your ultimate duty to the man who created the trust? To the integrity of his final wishes? You know as well as I do that she is violating the spirit, if not the letter, of that document. But now, I think we both know she's violating the letter of it, too. I switched the image on my phone to the financial statements, the proof of the Shell Corporation, the summary of the failed hotel investment. I showed him the evidence of her gross mismanagement. He slowly sank onto a bench, his briefcase slumping to the floor beside him. He looked utterly defeated. I suspected, he whispered, more to himself than to me. The requests for capital transfers, they seemed excessive. Unwise. But she was so forceful. She manipulated you, Arthur. Just like she manipulates everyone else, I said, sitting beside him. I wasn't angry with him. I felt a pang of pity for this old man, caught between a dead friend he respected and a living tyrant he feared. I'm not asking you to betray your client. I'm asking you to uphold the true terms of the trust Richard hired you to protect. That clause is a legal directive. It supersedes her authority as trustee, but only if it's triggered. We need to trigger it. A spark of the old lawyerly fire returned to his eyes. He looked at me, truly seeing me for the first time not as the interloper, but as an ally. How? With an audit, I said, laying out the plan. A full, comprehensive audit of the estate's finances since Richard's death. You're her lawyer. You need to advise her that in order for her addendum disinheriting me to be legally unassailable, it must be supported by a complete and transparent valuation of the trust's assets. Frame it as a necessary evil to bulletproof her case against any future challenges from me or Thomas. Tell her it's a formality, a way to show that all her administrative decisions have been sound. Hemmings was silent for a long moment. I could see the gears turning in his sharp legal mind. He was weighing the risks, the ethics, the potential fallout. Finally, he looked at me, a decision made. She's arrogant, he said, a slow, grim smile forming on his face. She believes she's invincible. She won't see the trap until it's already sprung. It's brilliant, Mrs. Vance. And it's exactly what Richard would have wanted. The war began, but it was a silent one, fought in emails, financial statements, and quiet, clandestine meetings. Hemmings played his part perfectly. He called Eleanor and, with a tone of weary resignation, advised her to authorize the audit. He told her Thomas and I were preparing a frivolous lawsuit, and that a clean audit would be her silver bullet, shutting us down for good. As predicted, her vanity and arrogance made her agree without a second thought. She signed the authorization papers, believing she was signing my death warrant. In reality, she was signing her own. While the auditors, a discreet firm Hemmings recommended, began their work, Thomas and I gathered more ammunition. We compiled a complete dossier on her mismanagement, creating a clear and damning timeline of her financial recklessness. We cross-referenced her personal credit card statements, which Thomas still had access to, with the estate's withdrawals, proving she had used trust funds to pay for personal luxuries, trips, and even to lend money to her sycophantic friends. Every purchase was a nail in her coffin. During this time, we had to maintain the illusion of defeat. We were quiet, withdrawn. We declined social invitations. We let the Charleston rumor mill churn with stories of our marital strife and my imminent departure. Eleanor was gloating. We heard through the grapevine that she was telling her friends that Thomas had finally come to his senses, and that the unfortunate chapter of my presence in the family was drawing to a close. She was so confident, so utterly consumed by her victory, that she never once questioned the audit she had authorized. She never thought to look over her shoulder. She was a queen admiring her own reflection, oblivious to the fact that her throne was rigged with dynamite. The hardest part was the waiting. For 6 weeks, the auditors delved into the complex web of the Vance estate. I went back to work at the library, finding solace in the quiet order of the archives, in the simple truth of history recorded on paper. Thomas and I grew closer than ever, a team united against a common enemy. The pretense of our life fell away, replaced by a raw, honest partnership. We were fighting for our future, and for the memory of the man who had brought us together. Finally, the call came. It was Arthur Hemmings. "The report is complete," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's exactly what you thought. It's worse, in fact. I'm calling a final meeting to execute the addendum. Tomorrow. My office. 10 a.m. The stage was set. The trap was laid. All that was left was for the Queen to walk into it. The morning of the meeting was gray and overcast, the sky threatening another Charleston downpour. The atmosphere in Arthur Hemmings's office was a perfect echo of that first, humiliating day, yet everything was different. I was no longer the frightened victim. I was a co-conspirator, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. Thomas sat beside me, his hand resting calmly on my knee. His face was a mask of cool neutrality, but I could feel the coiled tension in him. Eleanor swept in precisely at 10 o'clock, dressed in a sharp, cream-colored Chanel suit, the picture of victory. She smelled of expensive perfume and triumph. She barely glanced at us, her attention focused on the stack of papers on the mahogany desk. She gave Arthur a brisk, condescending nod. "Arthur, let's get this over with, shall we? I have a lunch at the club." "Of course, Eleanor," Hemmings said, his voice impeccably professional. He gestured for her to sit. She took the seat opposite us, the same one she'd occupied before, and placed her leather handbag on the floor with a soft thud. She looked at me, a flicker of pure, unadulterated contempt in her eyes. "Clara, I see you've come to watch the final act. How brave of you." I simply met her gaze and said nothing. My silence seemed to unnerve her more than any argument could have. Hemmings cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He picked up the top document from the stack. Eleanor reached for her pen, an expensive Mont Blanc from her handbag. "Is that the signature page?" she asked impatiently. "In a moment, Eleanor," the lawyer said calmly. "First, as per standard legal procedure when executing an amendment to a trust of this size, we must review the precipitating documentation. Specifically, the results of the estate audit which you authorized on August the 12th. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "A formality. I'm sure everything is perfectly in order. Just show me where to sign." "Nevertheless," Hemmings insisted, his voice hardening slightly, "the findings must be entered into the record." He opened the thick, bound report. "The audit, conducted by Deloitte, has uncovered a series of significant financial irregularities in the management of the Vance Family Trust over the past 2 years." He began to read, his voice a dispassionate drone that methodically dismantled Eleanor's world. He listed the unauthorized capital transfers, the shell corporation, the speculative investments, the leveraging of secure assets. He detailed line by line over $3 million in mismanaged, squandered, or improperly redirected funds. Eleanor's smug composure began to crack. The color drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a garish mask. "This is absurd. It's a lie. My friends, these were sound investments." "They were catastrophic failures, Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice cutting through her protests like a shard of glass. "You gambled away Dad's legacy to prop up your friends' vanity projects." "You stay out of this," she hissed, her eyes wild. "This is my house, my money." "Actually," Hemmings interrupted, looking up from the report, "that is no longer the case." He set the audit aside and picked up another document. It was a copy of the original trust agreement. "I'd like to draw your attention to Article 4, Section C. A clause Richard insisted we include in his final revision. He called it the fiduciary guardian clause." He began to read the clause aloud. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was brutally clear. It spoke of gross mismanagement, of actions that undermine the stated intent of the will, and of the immediate and irrevocable revocation of the trustee's authority should an audit confirm such actions. Eleanor stared at him, her mouth slightly agape, a dawning horror in her eyes. She had no memory of it, no idea it even existed. Hemmings finished reading the clause and looked at her over the top of his glasses. "Eleanor, the audit you authorized has officially triggered this clause. As of this moment, your authority as the primary trustee of the Vance Family Trust is terminated." The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the frantic, panicked breathing from my mother-in-law. "Terminated?" she whispered, the word hollow. You can't. I am the trustee. Not anymore, Hemmings said. He slid a final document across the desk toward Thomas and me. It was not the addendum to disinherit me. It was the legal transfer of authority. As per Richard's explicit directive within the clause, full control of the Vance estate, its properties, and all its assets now passes to the designated successors. Jointly, Eleanor followed his gaze to the signature line on the document. There, typed in neat black ink, were the names, Thomas Richard Vance and Clara Annabelle Vance. She looked from the paper to me, her face a grotesque canvas of disbelief, fury, and dawning terror. She finally understood. This was no accident. It was a perfectly executed coup, and I was the architect. You, she breathed, the word dripping with venom. This was you, the little archivist, the dusty little nobody. I met her gaze, my expression calm. Richard was a good man, Eleanor. He was a meticulous man. He loved his family, and he took steps to protect it. I reached up and unclasped the sapphire brooch from my dress, the very one she had used to humiliate me. I placed it gently on top of the stack of papers on the desk. He also knew who to trust. Hemmings added the final, crushing blow. The clause also stipulates that in the event of its activation, the personal allowance for the former trustee is to be reduced to the state-mandated minimum. And as the family home on Broad Street is an asset of the trust, now under new management, you will be required to vacate the premises within 90 days. That was it. The final break. Eleanor Vance, the Queen of Charleston society, was deposed. Not by a lawsuit, not by a public fight, but by the quiet, precise words of the husband she had betrayed, activated by the woman she had tried to destroy. She made a choked, guttural sound and stumbled to her feet, knocking her chair over. She gave us one last look of pure, incandescent hatred, then fled the room without another word. The heavy office door slammed shut behind her, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. Arthur Hemmings slowly took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Thomas reached over and took my hand, his grip firm and sure. The war was over. We had won. In the months that followed, we worked tirelessly with Arthur Hemmings and a team of financial advisors to undo the damage Eleanor had wrought. We stabilized the estate, paid off the debts she'd incurred, and began the slow, careful process of rebuilding Richard's legacy. We moved into the main house on Broad Street, and walking through its grand, historic rooms felt less like a victory and more like a solemn duty. We weren't conquerors. We were stewards, tasked with preserving a history that had almost been erased by vanity and greed. The news of Eleanor's fall from grace ripped through Charleston society like a hurricane. Without the Vance fortune to fuel her influence, her power evaporated overnight. Her friends, the ones she had propped up with my husband's inheritance, abandoned her instantly. She sold her jewelry and her designer clothes to afford a small, unremarkable condominium in a bland suburb north of the city. We heard she had tried to get back on a few charity boards, but the doors that had once swung open so eagerly for her were now firmly shut. She had become a ghost in the city she once ruled. We never saw her again. Thomas tried to reach out once, out of a lingering, painful sense of filial duty, but she never returned his call. It was for the best. Some wounds are too deep to ever truly heal. Life settled into a new, quiet rhythm. The house began to feel like a home, filled with our own life, our own laughter. We honored Richard by establishing a grant in his name at the Charleston Library Society, funding the work of young archivists and historians like me. His memory was no longer a sad, fading photograph, but a living, breathing part of our future. About a year after that final meeting, a single letter arrived for me, forwarded from our old carriage house. The envelope was cheap, the handwriting shaky and filled with rage. It was from a cut-rate retirement community in Asheville, North Carolina. She must have moved again, seeking anonymity in the mountains. I opened it. There was no greeting, no sign-off. Just a single, spiteful sentence scrawled in angry blue ink. I read the words, a final, pathetic volley of poison from a defeated queen. I walked out into the garden, the same garden where Richard had first welcomed me into his family. The late afternoon sun filtered through the Spanish moss, dappling the stone path in gold. I looked at the hateful words on the cheap paper, then let the letter fall from my fingers, allowing it to settle among a bed of wilting autumn roses. I never wrote back. Some ghosts are best left to haunt themselves. The end.